900 miles to the north, over the empty plains of Saskatchewan, the sky had already turned the color of iron. The old trappers up there knew what that color meant. They were pulling their dogs inside. They were stacking wood against the inside of their doors. They were not speaking of it, because to speak of it was to call it down. But they knew. A blue norther was forming. The kind that comes once in 40 years. The kind that ends towns. Hannah Mercer did not know about the iron sky. She lived alone on a bend of the Powder River in Wyoming Territory, in a shack no bigger than a stable stall, with a brindle hound at her feet and a widow's silence in her bones. But she had been counting the geese, and the geese had crossed the valley 3 weeks early. She had been watching the muskrats, and their coats had grown thick by September. She had been listening to a river that was freezing faster than any river had a right to freeze. The men in town were laughing at her. They had been laughing for months, ever since she began stripping bark from the cottonwoods and stacking it behind her shack like a woman gone strange in her grief. 11 layers she meant to nail to her walls. 11 layers of nothing but tree skin against a Wyoming winter. By the night of December the 2nd, the laughter would stop. By midnight, 3 of those same men would be on their knees at her door. And what kept them alive, in the end, was not the bark alone. It was the frozen river behind her shack, doing a quiet, patient work that not one man in the valley had ever bothered to understand. The plan had come to her in pieces, the way real plans do. It came first from her father, dead 19 years now, who had built lodges with the Crow before the railroads came, and who had told her, when she was small, that a tree wears its winter coat on the outside, not the inside, and that a man who builds a house ought to remember he is only borrowing from the tree. It came second from a Norwegian woman she had met once at Fort Laramie, a midwife with hands like roots, who had said in broken English that her own grandmother in the old country had layered birch bark 11 deep against the north wall of a cow byre, and the cows had birthed warm even in the worst Februaries. It came third from the river itself, which Hannah had begun to understand was not only water but a road, and a larder, and, if a person paid attention, a furnace of a particular and counterintuitive kind. She started gathering bark in early September. She took it from cottonwood and from pine and from the great peeling birches that grew in the wet hollows 2 miles upstream. She took it carefully, the way her father had shown her, never girdling a living tree, taking only from the fallen and from the half-fallen and from the trees the beavers had already condemned. She stacked it behind her shack in long flat ricks, weighed down with river stones, and she let the autumn sun cure it until the slabs grew stiff and dark and smelled like a smokehouse. By the 2nd week of September, the town had noticed Otis Crane, the blacksmith, a broad man with a burn scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow, leaned on his anvil one afternoon when Hannah passed by with a sled of bark behind her, and he said, loud enough for the street to hear, "Mercer woman's building herself a beaver dam. Reckon she means to winter underwater." 2 men by the trough laughed. Reverend Silas Hatch was kinder, in the way certain preachers are kinder, which is to say he was condescending in a softer voice. He came out to her shack on a Tuesday with his Bible held against his chest like a shield, and he stood at the edge of her bark ricks and said, "Mrs. Mercer, a widow alone is the particular care of the Lord and the particular concern of his church. There are good cabins in town. The Petersons have a room. You needn't," he searched for the word, "invent." "I'm not inventing, Reverend," Hannah said. She did not look up from the slab of birch she was scraping clean. "I'm remembering." He did not know what to do with that, so he blessed her and went home. The third was Lemuel Doss, who ran the saloon and the trading post out of the same long building, because in Cold Fork there was not enough of either to justify 2 roofs. Doss was a thin man with a thin mustache and a thin sense of his own cleverness, and when Hannah came in to trade 3 jars of chokecherry preserves for a coil of waxed twine, he held the twine just out of her reach and said, "Tell me true now, Hannah. Are you fixing to wrap that shack like a Christmas parcel? Because I'll sell you ribbon cheaper than rope." The men at the bar laughed. One of them, a teamster named Will Boggs, laughed so hard he spilled his glass. Hannah took the twine when Doss finally set it down. She paid in preserves. She walked out into the cold blue afternoon without a word, and the laughter followed her halfway down the street before the wind took it. That night, by the light of a single tallow candle, she sat at her small pine table and she wrote in the back of her dead husband's account book, in pencil, in a hand that had grown careful since his death, 11 layers. North wall first, then west, then the roof. Then the river. She underlined the river twice. She did not know yet. Could not have known, not exactly, that 200 miles to the north, over the Canadian line, a mass of air was already gathering that the old trappers would later call the Blue Norther of '84. She only knew what the geese knew, what the muskrats knew, what her father, 19 years buried, had known. She blew out the candle. Bram sighed at her feet. Outside, the first true frost of the year crept across the window glass in feathers, and somewhere across the valley a wolf called once, and did not call again. The work began the next morning before the sun cleared the ridge. Hannah rose in the dark, the way she had risen every morning since her husband died, and she built the fire in the small iron stove, and she boiled water for tea, and she ate a piece of cold cornbread standing at the window. The thermometer her husband had nailed to the doorframe, a cheap thing from Omaha with a brass back gone green, read 19 degrees. It was October the 4th. She put on her wool coat and her father's old elk-hide gloves, and she went out to the rick of bark behind the shack. The first layer was cottonwood, because cottonwood was soft and would mold itself to the rough planks of the north wall, filling the small gaps and the knotholes and the place where the chinking had fallen out 2 winters back. She cut each slab to the height of the wall with a draw knife, and she set them one beside the other, vertical, overlapping each seam by 2 fingers. She nailed them with square-cut nails she had pulled from the wreck of an old corn crib down by the bend, straightened on a flat stone, and saved in a tin can. She did not waste a nail. She did not waste anything. The cottonwood smelled green and faintly sour, like a creek bottom in July. The second layer was pine bark, and it went on horizontal, crossing the seams of the cottonwood the way a good mason crosses the joints of his stones. She had learned this from watching her father build a smokehouse when she was 9. That strength came not from any single layer, but from the way the layers refused to agree on where their weaknesses were. By noon, her shoulders ached. By the end of the first day, the north wall had 3 layers, and her hands were black with sap, and Bram had eaten 2 cold biscuits and a strip of jerky, and was asleep under the table with his head on her boot. She did not stop on Sunday, the Reverend noticed. He did not come out again, but she could feel him noticing from across the valley, the way a person can feel a stare on the back of the neck. The 4th layer was birch, from the wet hollows, and it was the prettiest of all of them, pale and silver-skinned, peeling in long sheets that curled at the ends like old paper. Birch bark, her father had told her once, would not rot. The Crow had wrapped their dead in it. The Ojibwe had built whole canoes from it that lasted 20 years in the water. Birch held a secret. He said it kept the water out and the warmth in, and it asked very little in return. She set the birch with the white side facing inward, toward the cottonwood, because the white side was the side the tree had kept hidden, and she had a feeling, only a feeling, that the tree had kept it hidden for a reason. The 5th layer was pine again. The 6th was cottonwood. The 7th was birch. She alternated them like the rings of a great slow drum, and as she worked, the shack began to change. It did not look like a shack anymore. It looked like something that had grown there. Something the river itself might have left behind in a flood 100 years ago and forgotten. Bram took to sleeping against the new north wall in the afternoons, even when the sun was on the other side. Hannah noticed this on the 8th day, and she stood for a long time with her hand against the bark, and she understood, without quite being able to put it into words, that the wall was already warm, not from the stove, not from the sun, from itself, from the still air trapped in 11,000 small spaces between 11 layers of bark, each layer a little dead and a little alive, each layer holding the breath of the tree it had come from. This was the forgotten thing. The thing the men in town did not know, because the men in town had been taught to build with milled lumber and tar paper, and milled lumber and tar paper had no breath in them. A board was a board. A bark was a multitude. Her father had a word for it, in his rough way. He had called it the sleeping warmth, the warmth a tree carries into winter even after the sap has gone down. The warmth that is not heat, exactly, but the refusal of cold to pass. By the 3rd week of October, the north wall was finished, 11 layers, thick as a man's forearm, dark and shaggy and strange. She began the west wall the next morning. It was during the west wall that the boy came. His name was Tobias Reed. He was 9 years old, the son of a homesteader 2 miles downriver, and he had a habit of wandering when his chores were done. He came up the bank one cold, bright afternoon, with a willow stick in his hand and a string of 3 small trout. and he stood at the edge of Hannah's yard and watched her work without saying anything for almost an hour. Finally, she said, without turning around, "You'll catch your death standing still in this wind, Tobias." He came closer. He looked at the wall. He said, "Pa says you've gone touched. Your pa is welcome to his opinion." The boy considered this. Then he said, "Can I help?" She turned and looked at him. He had his mother's eyes, which Hannah remembered from a funeral 2 years back. The mother gone in childbirth, the baby with her. The boy and his father had been alone ever since. "You can hold the slabs while I nail," she said. He held the slabs. He held them seriously, the way a child holds a thing when he has decided to be useful. He did not chatter. He watched her hands. After an hour, he said, "It's like a tree wearing another tree." Hannah stopped with the hammer half raised. She looked at the boy. She said, "Yes, that's exactly what it is." He came back the next day, and the day after. The roof was the hardest. She had to climb a ladder her husband had built before he died, and the ladder was a little too short and a little too narrow, and the wind on the roof was always 5 degrees colder than the wind on the ground. She laid the bark on the roof in shingles, overlapping deeply, the way the cedar shakes overlap on a Norwegian stave church, the way the scales overlap on a trout. 11 layers, the same as the walls, but laid at a steeper angle so the snow would shed instead of settle. She worked into November. The days grew shorter. The river ice grew thicker. And then, on the 14th of November, she did the last thing. The thing none of them, not Crane nor Hatch nor Doss, would have understood even if she had tried to explain it. She built a low stone berm in the shape of a half-moon between her shack and the river. Not a wall, a berm. 3 feet high, 4 feet thick at the base, made of flat river stones she had hauled up over 6 weeks of evenings while her arms still had strength left after the bark work. The berm faced north. Its open side faced the river. She was using the river. She had watched the river for 9 winters. And she had noticed a thing the men in town had never bothered to notice, that the air just above a frozen river, in the deepest cold, is warmer than the air over open ground. Not warm, never warm, but warmer, by 5 degrees, sometimes 10, because the ice itself releases the last small heat of the water beneath it, slowly, all winter long, the way a stone in a fire pit releases heat long after the flames have died. Thermal mass, a geologist would have called it, 50 years later. Hannah called it nothing. She only knew it was true. The berm would catch that drifting river warmth and funnel it against the south side of her shack. The bark would hold whatever it caught, and the stove inside, small as it was, would only have to do the last small work of comfort, not the whole brutal labor of survival. She finished the berm on the 18th of November. She stood back. She looked at what she had built. The shack was no longer a shack. It was a dark, shaggy thing crouched between a half-moon of stone and a river of ice, and the smoke from its tin pipe rose perfectly straight in the still, cold air, the way smoke only rises when a house is at peace with its weather. That night Tobias's father came up the bank. His name was Caleb Reed, and he was a hard man, not unkind but hard, the way widowers become hard when they have a son to raise and no woman to soften the corners. He stood in the yard and he looked at the shack and he did not laugh. Hannah saw that he did not laugh, and she marked it. He said, "The boy speaks of you. He's a good boy. He says you're building something none of us have seen." "I'm building a wall, Mr. Reed." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's talk in town. They say you're losing your reason. And what do you say?" Caleb Reed looked at the dark bark wall and the half-moon of stone and the straight column of smoke. He said, "I say a woman who watches the geese is not losing anything." He tipped his hat. He went back down the bank to his son. Hannah stood in her yard a while longer. The first true snow of the year began to fall, small dry flakes, the kind that mean cold, not wait. But what Hannah did not know, what she could not have known, was that 900 miles to the north, over the empty plains of Saskatchewan, the sky had already turned the color of iron, and a wind had begun to gather there that had not been seen in the Powder River country in 40 years, and was not going to be seen again for another 60. It was coming south, it was coming fast, and it was bringing with it the kind of cold that ends towns. The blue norther broke over Cold Fork on the night of December the 2nd. It came without much warning, the way the worst of them always do. The afternoon had been clear, a hard pale clear, the kind of clear that has no warmth in it, and the thermometer at noon had read 11 degrees, which was cold but not extraordinary. By 4 in the afternoon, it read -6. By 6, it read -19. By 8, the brass needle had gone all the way to the bottom of the scale and stopped there, quivering, as if it too were afraid. The wind came first as a long, low moan from the north, and then as a roar. It picked up the dry snow that had fallen the week before, and it drove that snow horizontal across the valley at 50 miles an hour. And the snow stripped the bark off young trees and the paint off the south sides of barns. And in the streets of Cold Fork, a man could not see his own hand at the end of his own arm. Otis Crane's smithy lost its roof at 9:30. The wind took it whole, peeled it back like the lid of a tin, and Otis stood in his own forge in the dark with the snow falling on his anvil and on the back of his neck, and he understood for the first time in his life that he was a small thing. The Petersons' cabin, the one Reverend Hatch had wanted Hannah to winter in, lost its chinking on the north side at 10. The wind came through the gaps in long knives of cold, and the stove could not keep up, and the children began to cry, and Mrs. Peterson wrapped them in every quilt in the house, and still their lips went blue. Lemuel Doss's saloon held, because the saloon was built of squared logs 2 feet thick, but the windows blew in, and the long mirror behind the bar cracked from corner to corner with a sound like a rifle shot, and the men inside, 6 of them, trapped by the storm, drunk and getting drunker, fell silent and listened to the wind and understood that the wind was not going to stop. Out on the homesteads, it was worse. 3 of Caleb Reed's cattle froze standing up against the lee of his barn, their eyes still open, ice in their nostrils. He found them at first light. He did not have time to grieve them. He had a son to keep alive, and the chinking in his own cabin was failing, and the stovepipe had begun to draw poorly because the wind was forcing the smoke back down. He sat up all that first night with Tobias wrapped in his lap and a wool blanket over them both, and he watched the frost climb the inside of his window, and he prayed in a way he had not prayed since his wife died. At Hannah Mercer's shack, the wind hit the north wall at 10 minutes past 8. It hit hard. The whole shack shuddered. A tin cup fell off the shelf above the stove and rolled across the floor, and Bram lifted his head and looked at Hannah, and Hannah looked back at him, and neither of them moved. The wind hit again and again. And then it settled into the long, steady roar of a true blizzard, and Hannah listened, and she waited, and she understood slowly, over the course of perhaps an hour, that nothing was getting through. The 11 layers of bark were holding. The wind beat against them the way the sea beats against a cliff, and the bark gave the way a cliff gives, which is to say it did not give at all. The cottonwood absorbed the first shock. The pine spread it sideways. The birch shed the cold the way it had shed water for 10,000 years. And between the layers, in 11,000 small dark spaces, the still air did the quiet patient work that still air does, which is to refuse to move, and in refusing to move, refuse to carry the cold. The shack stayed at 52 degrees that whole first night. Hannah only had to feed the stove twice, but there was a moment, there is always a moment, when even she doubted. It came around 3 in the morning. The wind shifted. It found, or seemed to find, a single weak place in the west wall, near the eaves where she had been tired the day she nailed that section and had perhaps overlapped only by 1 finger instead of 2. A thin, cold thread of air began to whistle through, low and steady, and Hannah heard it, and she sat up in her bed, and she felt the cold thread on her cheek, and for one long bad moment she thought, I have missed something. I have missed one small thing. And one small thing in a storm like this is the same as missing everything. She got up. She lit the candle. She found the place with her palm, a spot no wider than a child's hand. She took a strip of birch bark from the small store she had kept inside for the stove, and she wedged it into the gap with the back of a butter knife, and she held it there until the cold thread stopped, and then she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and she cried for the first time since her husband had died, not from fear but from the great tired relief of a thing held together by a hand against a wall. Bram came and put his head in her lap. The wind went on. The wind went on for 2 days and 2 nights. When she opened the door on the morning of December the 5th, the snow had drifted to the eaves of her shack on the north side, but the south side, the side that faced the river, was almost clear, because the half-moon berm had done its work and split the wind around the house like water around the prow of a boat. The river itself was a long, pale road of ice. The sun came out, weak and gold, and the air was 22 below zero. It was just after midnight on the 3rd night, the wind still howling, when the knock came on the door. It was so soft at first that Hannah thought she had imagined it. She thought it was a branch or a piece of bark working loose somewhere in the dark. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks, low on the door, the way a man knocks when he has very little strength left in his hand. Bram lifted his head. He did not growl. He looked at the door, and then he looked at Hannah, and she understood by his look that whoever was out there was not a danger but a need. She got up. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She crossed the small, warm room. She put her hand on the latch. She opened the door. Caleb Reed stood there with his son in his arms. The boy was conscious but barely. His lips were the color of slate. His father's beard was white with frost, and his eyes had the wild, flat look of a man who has walked 2 miles through a blizzard at 20 below and has been thinking, the whole way, that he would not arrive. Behind him, 3 more shapes stumbled up out of the snow. Otis Crane, the blacksmith, with a strip of burlap wrapped around his face and his great burned forearm cradling a small bundle that turned out to be his wife's tabby cat, the only thing he had thought to save when the smithy roof went. Reverend Silas Hatch, his Bible gone, his hat gone, walking on feet he could no longer feel, and behind the Reverend, leaning on him, Lemuel Doss of the saloon, who had walked the last half-mile with his eyes closed because the wind had frozen his lashes shut. They had come together. Somewhere in the storm, by whatever instinct moves men in the last hour, they had found each other on the road, and they had decided, or one of them had decided, and the others had followed, that the only smoke still rising in all the valley was the smoke from Hannah Mercer's tin pipe. Hannah did not say a word. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "Come in, then, if you must." She did not say anything at all. She only stepped back, and she opened the door wider, and she gestured them inside, and one by one they came. Caleb first with the boy, then Otis with the cat, then the Reverend, then Doss, and the warmth of the shack took them the way a mother takes a child, without judgment, without question, only with the simple animal fact of warmth. She put the boy in her own bed. She heated water on the stove. She made Caleb sit by the fire, and she took off his boots and she rubbed his feet between her 2 hands for almost an hour, until the feeling came back into them, and he wept silently into his beard. She gave Otis a wool blanket for the cat. She gave the Reverend a cup of broth and a place by the wall where the bark was thickest. She gave Lemuel Doss nothing but a chair, because he was the one who had laughed loudest in the saloon. And she was a woman, not a saint, and the chair was enough. He took it. He sat in it. He stared at the floor for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Mrs. Mercer, I am sorry." She nodded once. She did not answer. They stayed 3 days. The wind did not break until the morning of December the 6th, and even then the cold held, and no one could travel until the 8th. Hannah fed them all from her root cellar, and from the smoked trout in her rafters, and from the choked cherry preserves she had not traded to Doss. She slept on the floor with Bram. She did not complain. On the morning of the 8th, the men went home. Caleb Reed carried his son out wrapped in Hannah's own quilt, and he stopped at the door, and he turned, and he looked at her for a long moment, and he said, "I'll bring the quilt back." "Mrs. Mercer, bring the boy back too," she said. "He's a help with the bark." Caleb nodded. He went down the bank. The Reverend was the last to leave. He stood in her yard, and he looked at the dark, shaggy walls of her shack, and at the half-moon berm now half buried in clean snow, and at the river of ice glowing pale gold in the late morning sun. He said, "Mrs. Mercer, I came to you in September, and I spoke of inventing. I was wrong. You were remembering, and he searched, the way preachers search. I had forgotten what remembering looks like." She did not answer that either. She only inclined her head the smallest fraction of an inch, and the Reverend understood, and he went home. Spring came late that year. The river broke up in the 2nd week of April, with a long sound like distant cannon as the ice shelved and turned and went south. The cottonwoods leafed out. The geese came back, and Hannah counted them, and the number was a good number. Tobias Reed came up the bank one bright morning in May with a fishing pole and a question about how the bark wall worked, and Hannah sat him down on the stone berm and told him, slowly, the whole of it, the trees and the still air and the river's small, slow warmth. And the boy listened the way only a boy listens who has decided he is going to remember a thing his whole life. By summer, 4 other shacks in the valley had bark walls. By the next winter, 11, Hannah Mercer lived in that shack for 31 more years. She never remarried. She never moved to town. When she died in the autumn of 1915, the shack was still standing and the bark was still holding, and the half-moon berm was still splitting the north wind around her door the way it had split it the night the men came. The shack stands yet. There is a small brass plate on the door now, put there by Tobias Reed's grandson in 1962. and the plate reads only her name and the years she lived, and below that, in smaller letters, 4 words. She remembered the trees. On the frontier, wisdom wasn't loud. It wasn't the man who shouted in the saloon, or the preacher who thundered from the pulpit, or the blacksmith who laughed at a woman with an axe. Wisdom was the thing still standing when the storm was done. It was the bark on the wall, and the stone in the berm, and the river under its own ice, doing its own slow, patient work that no one had asked it to do, and no one had thought to thank it for. Wisdom was a woman who counted the geese, and listened to her father 19 years in his grave, and trusted what the trees had been trying to tell her all along. The men of Cold Fork forgot many things in the years after that winter. They forgot the price of cattle in '83, and the name of the governor who took office in '85. They forgot which spring it was that the locusts came, and which summer the well went dry. They never forgot Hannah Mercer. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting.